Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The event will start in a moment.
Do you want me to start on because they asked?
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much. For those I might not have met, I'm Ian Lesser from the German Marshall Fund of the United States, based in Brussels, and it's a great pleasure on behalf of GMF to welcome you all here this afternoon for this conversation, a conversation on geopolitics, connectivity, and energy security. And we talk about it as the Athens conversation because, in fact, this is the third in a set of conversations that we've had, starting in Washington, moving to Brussels, and now here in Athens. And we're extraordinarily pleased to be able to do this in cooperation with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Stassis, in Washington, and with the cooperation, collaboration of the Public Power Corporation of Greece. And we'll hear from PPC's chairman and CEO, George Stassis, in a moment. George, thank you very much for this. And again, thanks to all of you for joining us. GMF's mission, very simply, is to strengthen transatlantic cooperation. That's an interesting topic these days. We'll talk about that. But we also have a lot of other things to talk about that have to do with this region, that have to do with the energy future, with innovation, and with connectivity above all. Just to give you a little bit of a roadmap to what we're going to do, we'll have some remarks up here first to start. And then we're going to move into our first session, which will be focusing on the geopolitical context. And then after that, we'll talk about innovation, we'll talk about connectivity, and we'll talk finally about how these things are being addressed on both sides of the Atlantic. And we have a wonderful group of people with us to do all of that. But before we launch into our first session, please join me in welcoming George Stassis. Thank you. Thank you.
So, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, esteemed colleagues, and for those of you also who came from abroad, a very big welcome to Athens. Thank you very much for being here with us today. 1 year ago, when we started this collaboration with CSIS and GMF, we started with a similar event in Washington, D.C., in which I laid out a set of reasons why a transatlantic partnership, especially in the energy sector, is absolutely crucial. In the meantime, we live in a rapidly changing geopolitical and economic landscape. As we stand at the intersection of shifting global power dynamics, technological transformation, and urgent energy challenges, I still stand for the arguments I supported last year. I still believe in the value of the transatlantic partnership and its impact in the prosperity of the economies, both here in Europe and across the Atlantic. I strongly believe that the answer to why the transatlantic cooperation is valuable has not changed. The combined effect of our partnership is greater than the sum of our individual efforts. It is though the how we are coming together that might need to be adjusted nowadays. In Europe, we are at a transformative moment. The recent geopolitical and energy crises made Europe's priorities very clear: to achieve strategic autonomy while boosting European competitiveness. Considering also the new administration's priorities in the United States, in this new era, we might need to rethink the transatlantic alliance through the lens of business-driven solutions and secure mutual benefits. The energy and digital sectors offer fertile ground to Europe and the United States for business-driven solutions, with an emphasis on security, technological innovation, and economic growth. In 2022, the United States supplied Europe with a very much needed LNG to tackle the European energy and security supply crises. Today, Europe and the United States have the opportunity to work together on data centers development to ensure that they are at the forefront of technological progress in an increasingly digital world. In this context, PPC's transformation stands as an example of a mission-driven business model. Each step we took over the last 5 years made this business sense. Each strategic move, acquisition, project we followed and we executed it, brings value to our shareholders and to our customers. We are doing that by first defining and then year by year delivering on our mission. In this process, we have incrementally improved all elements of the energy trilemma while making the best economic decision of our company and stakeholders. Through a €7 billion investment that we performed over the past 5 years, PPC Group, the biggest utility in the southeast region of Europe, is driving energy equity, energy security, and innovation in the region. We leverage technological progress and steep cost curves to produce homegrown renewable electricity. That, coupled with expansion and modernization of our power grids, contributes to the affordability and energy security of the region and eventually in its stability. To really ensure security of supply, though, we need more for the times the sun doesn't shine or the wind doesn't blow. This is why we invest in flexible capacity, pumping hydro, batteries, and of course, gas. And these technologies deliver value. Such an example is our investments in Alexandroupoli, an area that is becoming of paramount importance for the energy security of Europe. Moving forward, we are investing more than €10 billion for the next 3 years, 25, 26, 27, in the energy. Most of it goes to clean and flexible energy and grids in order to create a resilient and interconnected system in Southeast Europe that can provide flexibility in the face of geopolitical shocks of the 21st century. Ladies and gentlemen, we live in a world where everything is becoming even more interlinked. This couldn't be clearer than in the words of energy and digital. Energy and digital sectors are becoming critical, essential one to the other. Energy security is no longer merely about access to resources. The future of connectivity lies beyond physical infrastructure, namely pipeline and power lines. The digital world is no longer merely about connection speeds and faster servers. The energy world needs the technology to manage its production and grids. And the digital world craves for megawatts, so for its machines to be able to think. If it feels that data centers are suddenly everywhere, that is because they are. AI adoption is extremely rapid and demand for data centers is skyrocketing globally. The pressing question is, can supply keep up? And most importantly, is there enough grid infrastructure? And as the answer to both questions is no, how can we change that in a timely manner? This is where utilities need to be more than facilitators. They become strategic partners. And to seize this opportunity, PPC is defining the utility of the future. We're no longer just a commodity provider. We are a company that sits at the crossroads of power and digital, a clean power tech. And for this reason, we announced just last week the development of a mega data center in the area of West Macedonia, an area where our former lignite mines were located. Initially, our mega data center will have the capacity of 300 megawatts and gradually will move to the level of 1,000 megawatts. The expansion of data centers is an objective that would ensure US-based tech companies accelerate their AI journey, while Europe's competitiveness increases, embracing the digital revolution and satisfying its energy needs. In closing, PPC's commitment to lead the intersection of energy transition and data center development in Europe, becoming a clean power tech champion, is very strong. Given our geographical position at the crossroads of Europe, Asia, and Africa, the company plays a pivotal role in regional stability and growth. Our role is to show how regional cooperation can align with broader transatlantic goals and ensure we tackle challenges together and create opportunities for growth and innovation together. By fostering our partnerships, we can shape a more resilient, sustainable, and interconnected future. Looking forward for all the wonderful panel discussions here today. I really thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And let me invite our session panelists for the first session up here to join me, please.
Okay if I sit on the far right?
That probably is appropriate. But we'll see. I mean, you know, we're going to test these things. Welcome once again. There is a geopolitical context, which we thought was important to talk about. And we thought it would be great to take advantage of the fact that we have really four fantastic analysts, commentators, well-known people from Washington with us today to share some thoughts with us about, well, what's happening in Washington, but well beyond that. What's happening, what are the key drivers in terms of our geopolitical environment that are affecting this region, but affecting transatlantic futures overall. And let me just introduce them to you very, very, very briefly. We have with us Max Bergman, Director of the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia Program at CSIS in Washington. Max, thank you for being with us again. James Carafano, Senior Counsel to the President and E.W. Richardson Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. James, thank you. Charles Kupchan, from the Council on Foreign Relations, Senior Fellow, also at Georgetown University. Charlie, thank you for being with us again. And Peter Rao, a senior fellow and director of the Center on Europe and Eurasia at the Hudson Institute. Thanks to all of you for joining us here in Athens. I wanted to start out this way. What's going on in Washington? Let me ask that. And Max, maybe I could start with you first. How do we interpret what we're seeing? Because everybody is talking about this every day. What are we seeing?
Well, first, Ian, thanks so much for cooperation between GMF and CSIS, and thanks to PPC for having us at what is probably one of the most beautiful settings that I've been in to speak at a panel, or not one of the most beautiful settings. So what is happening in Washington? I'm very curious for the thoughts of the other panelists. But I think in some ways what you're seeing is an administration that has come in with a clear agenda and vision for how it sees the world. And that agenda and vision, I think, is in stark contrast to the previous administrations that we've seen, I think, really in a very long time. And I think in many ways that this is an administration that wants to implement how Trump sees the world. And I think the first Trump administration didn't necessarily do that. That there was Trump, when he won in 2016, was not necessarily surrounded by people that shared his outlook on the world. And there was a lot of tension and friction. Trump would give an order or direction, and it wouldn't necessarily be implemented. And then what's happened, I think, in the intervening 4 years, and this is true with, sometimes with Democratic administrations or Republican administrations, is that there's been a lot of thinking to how to implement Trump's vision. And so you see an administration coming in with an agenda, a plan, and wanting to really disrupt things. And the question is this sort of, I think, a revolution that we're seeing in how the US approaches the world, or is this a rebalancing? Right now, in the first few months, it always looks like a revolution because so much is happening. The question is, does the pace of events and activities begin to slow? And then, therefore, does it make it sort of more of a rebalancing? But then what is the revolution and rebalancing about? I think in some ways what we're seeing is equivalent to Brexit, and kind of how I conceive of it. That the United States wants to fundamentally reorient how it approaches the world, or at least the Trump administration does, views the traditional alliances and relationships that it's had for the past 80 years and is reconsidering that. And I think the question is do we have an abrupt departure to kind of a more nativist America, or is it a rebalancing where the U.S. maybe pulls troops out of Europe but is still, committed to NATO and European security? And I think a lot of those questions are still at play, and I think there's some divisions within the administration. I do think that maybe one closing point is that I think part of what we're also seeing is a degree of apathy toward Europe from this administration that is not unique to Trump. That I think for the last 24 years, really since 9/11, the United States has not really thought much about Europe. In the halls of Washington, in think tank roundtables, you see a lot of comments that resemble the sort of comments that you saw from J.D. Vance in that Signal chat of sort of disparaging toward Europe. So a sense that Europe doesn't matter that much, it's overregulated, its economy isn't going very much, it doesn't do much in the world. And I think all of that in some ways hits some stereotypes that may have some truth to it, but also really fail to recognize, and I think this is what Mr. Stassis was sort of hitting, the immense depth of the relationship between the US and the European Union, especially economically, and how important that is. And so we sort of are taking that for granted. And so I think the question is, do we have this big rupture, or do we kind of come to sort of see, actually Europe really matters to us, and the transatlantic relationship is critically important, not least because of the security dimension, but also because of the economic dimension.
Max, thank you very much. And by the way, I mean, thoughts, comments, questions. We're going to come to all of you at the end of our session, so please do gather up those thoughts. James, maybe I could turn to you. Max put to us the sort of proposition, question, is this a revolution? Is it a rebalancing? What is it? How do you interpret it from your point of view?
Well, first of all, Peter and I came over directly from the United States. Unlike Peter, I didn't sleep, so I've been awake for 36 hours. But I understand that you can go 48 hours and still operate machinery, so We can get through this together. I want to add something to what Max said, which is probably the most pressing issue in the room, which is why is Trump so damn disruptive? Why do we wake up every day and something else is infuriating? And there's two answers to that. Max alluded to one, which is people still think of him in many ways as the Trump of 2017, and he's absolutely not. This is a guy who was president for 4 years, learned a lot, has spent 4 years backed by literally thousands of people getting ready to govern again, and a man who is coming in with having demonstrated really maybe an unprecedented capacity to actually drive the federal government that we haven't seen since FDR. And he is a man in a hurry. Now, contrary to recent tweets on Truth Social, I don't think he's getting a third term, which means he has 4 years. And he has a lot to do in 4 years, and we could all debate the last administration, but his interpretation is the United States lost an enormous amount of ground the last 4 years, and his intent is to make that up. And there are two things that I think explain this absolute drive and almost, well, I don't want to say recklessness, but this, because I don't think he's being reckless, but this willingness to really be disruptive. The first is security. Everybody can say they want to pivot to Asia. We've had 4 presidents that wanted to do that now, including Donald Trump, Republican and Democrat. At the end of their terms, all 4 of them wound up just as engaged in all 3 theaters as when they started. That is not going to change. So the U.S. does not have the hard power capacity to dominate in any one of the 3 critical theaters, the Middle East, Europe, or the Indo-Pacific. That can only be done with allies. And so this relentless and some would say brutal push to have allies stand up and contribute in their own self-defense is something that he is completely impatient about. And Europeans should take solace that it's not just Europe. He's doing this in the Middle East. He's also doing this in the Indo-Pacific, because all 3 theaters are vital. And the other one is growth. We all need growth. We all need real, substantial growth, not just to pay for security, but to pay for all the things that are coming down the pike. And he is relentless in his pursuit of growth, and he's completely frustrated with everything in the existing system, whether it's the WTO or traditional trade order or global energy policies, and he is going to break those because he thinks they're an obstacle not just to our growth, but to our growth of friends and allies as well. So this impatience, this drive, that is just not going to stop until he achieves those 2 goals.
Okay, James, thank you very much for that. I want to again follow up on something that you mentioned, and perhaps Charlie, I can come to you for this. The burden sharing point is an old one. Multiple administrations have brought this to Europe with more or less success. His style is perhaps a little different, but nonetheless, the message is not that much different. Pay more, do more, etc. It strikes me that what is different, and I'd like to ask you about this, Charlie, and perhaps others might want to pick up on it, is the blend of this very pointed burden-sharing argument with a kind of conditionality. And beyond that, a kind of economic nationalism at the same time. I mean, we have a whole debate about, we haven't spoken about tariffs and all that policy yet, but these things, in fact, go together. Or, in fact, perhaps they don't go together. Can you have a kind of trade war with allies and still have cohesion? Charlie, what do you think?
Let me try to pick up on some things that James and Max said and circle back directly to the question. I agree with both of them that disruption is probably the most important word after 2.5 months of the Trump presidency. And I think on some level it's a disruption that is needed. And that is because for a couple of different reasons, the old order was wearing thin. And in some respects, I think the Biden administration was clinging to the old order. It was governing the world that was, and it wasn't working. And so Trump has come in and he sees a changing distribution of power in the system. He sees an American electorate for whom globalization and the digital age has not been particularly welcoming. I mean, vast swaths of the American electorate have seen their quality of life on a downward trajectory for the better part of the last several decades. And Trump has said, I'm for you. I hear you. I'm here to bring forward the Americans who have been left behind. And so to some extent, he's taking a wrecking ball to the post-World War II order because he thinks it's not working abroad and it's not working at home. The question, I think, is, well, what comes next? What is he going to do after he takes the wrecking ball to this system? And there, I think we just don't know. And that's because they don't know. And they don't know because I think this is an administration that has very different camps within it. One camp is Trump himself, who is not, in my mind, terribly ideological. He's very transactional. And to your comment, Ian, I think that he wants to make deals. Do I think he's going to pull out of NATO? No, I don't. Do I think he's going to press hard allies to spend more and reduce the U.S. presence in Europe? Yes, but I don't think he has a kind of vision that he's going to fulfill. I think he has aims that he wants to get to. I agree with James that he's determined to get there, but I don't see him as someone who kind of is out there to fulfill a certain messianic vision of where we're going. The other second camp would be the traditional Republican hawks, and I would put Rubio and I would put Waltz in that camp, broadly speaking, but I think they are powerless, and they know that they need to do what they're told, or they will be unemployed. So that sort of traditional Republican hawkish position will not make itself felt. The other camp, I think, is the real hardcore America first, led, I guess, by J.D. Vance. But that's in some ways where the majority of the cabinet is in some respects. And it's where Trump naturally tilts because that's his base. I don't think he necessarily buys into everything he wants, but he knows that that's why he got elected. And so he's going to tilt in that direction for now. My final comment, and this speaks more directly to your question, is I don't think we know whether it's a kind of rebalance or a rupture. I just don't think we know how far this is going to go. But I do think that politically speaking, where Trump is headed will not work. And you mentioned the trade war in your question. There is going to be a trade war. It's already started. What's it going to do to his voter base? Piss them off. Why? Because they're going to go to the store and see prices 20 to 25% higher. They're already upset that their Social Security Administration office and their HHS, Health and Human Services office, is closing. And so I do think that this is a guy who wants to be a political success. He is going to see in public opinion not necessarily his MAGA core turn away from him, but more centrist Republicans and independents. They're not going to like what they see. And my final comment would be, and this is what most worries me, honestly, about the Trump administration. I think many Americans are watching somebody who doesn't seem to understand the guardrails of American democracy. And, I think it was James who said, oh, he's not going to run for a third term. I don't know that. He just said yesterday he thinks he will run for a third term. Frankly speaking, that scares the hell out of me. And I think it scares the hell out of many other Americans.
Okay, Charlie, thank you. Peter, let me come to you. It's a lot on the table there. I would invite you to respond to it, but also there's another separate question which I'd maybe like to start to get into. And I know, George, you alluded to it in a way in your remarks. I mean, Europe will respond. Europe is responding in different sectors. The whole debate about strategic autonomy, the reality of new investments in different sectors, and so on. it's not just about American action. It's also about what happens on this side of the Atlantic. But anyway, let me let you talk about what you would like to talk about very briefly, and then we'll continue the conversation.
Well, let me begin by echoing Max and thanking you and the German Marshall Fund and Max and CSIS for allowing me to be up here with these esteemed colleagues, and thank the PPC group for supporting this event and for offering the intellectual appetizer for the discussion today. I suppose I would start by saying that what's happening in Washington, the grand big question you asked at the start, can be at least in part explained through two deep trends that I see in American politics. One is that the information revolution of today is fundamentally disrupting American society, indeed the whole world, in ways that the Industrial Revolution did in the 19th century. And in talking recently to an AI executive, she likened what is about to wash upon us to the age of the robber barons who managed to make huge amounts of money in one-off factories while artisanal trade crafts fell away. And she was previewing that what we see now in AI is only going to multiply and grow exponentially. And so I think a lot of the social ripple effects that many people have not just forecast but see come to fruition in recent years are now also making their way into politics. And so change is upon us. The second is that I think the Washington Consensus, the set of liberal institutions that were set up at the end of the Cold War and into the 90s, have been perceived by most Americans as failing us. The basic fundamental question that societies, open, free, democratic societies, ask themselves is, how can we protect ourselves against pernicious actors who want to do us harm from within? In the 2000s, that applied to terrorism, but more recently it applies also to the People's Republic of China. And I think many Americans have concluded that organizations like the World Trade Organization, which was referenced earlier, have not hindered or at least put guardrails, to use that phrase again, on the PRC's rise, but instead have facilitated China's rise, thereby weakening our own industrial heartland, our own manufacturing base, and our own economy. And so I sitting here as a 42-year-old, look back over the course of my adult life, and I don't see a lot of wins on the table that would cause kind of liberalism and liberal politics to get a vote of confidence from the American people. I came of age, there was 9/11, then we had a financial crisis, we had immigration crises, we had another economic crisis, we had the COVID crisis, and in none of those categories, two failed wars, one surely a defeat in Afghanistan, and Iraq at best a draw. I don't think that in any of those cases, bureaucracy, government performed well. And so it's natural for an outsider, which Donald Trump surely was, the first president to be elected to that office in 2016, who had not served as either commanding general or been elected to another high political office before, for an outsider with a new message to be able to score points as he did. And so I think two enduring features of Trumpism that are not just going to be a feature of this administration, but likely continue going forward, is greater transactionalism and more nationalism. Right now, we're seeing the Democratic Party in a process of weaving its way through the wilderness, trying to rebuild. But already one of the leading lights that seems to be getting a lot of attention is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, which isn't kind of a forecast of what might happen in 3 years. But if that's where the Democrats are going, then I don't think we're going to have a return to Clintonian or Blairite new liberalism in American politics. So when you ask what's happening in America, I think it's those meta forces that are really in play, and our politicians are surfing those waves as they go forward.
Okay, Peter, thank you. James, go ahead.
Circle back to a point that Charlie made on we're going to have a trade war and Trump's going to lose middle-class voters. I think you're just wrong. First of all, Trump has to deliver on growth. And it's not just important for his one term, which is the only one he'll have, is if Republicans want to keep the White House down the road, they have to deliver on the things that they promise, which is to raise the standard of living for everyday Americans and to grow jobs and grow the economy. So he cannot do things to the economy that do the opposite. And so I think there are on the economic front, I think there really are serious guardrails. He's not going to do things that actually, at the end of the day, make life worse for American consumers. Look at the response they made just on eggs. Like the price of eggs went up, and they mobilized the entire federal government to drive the price of eggs down. So I also don't think there's going to be a trade war. You know the one person that's never said trade war? Donald Trump. Donald Trump's never said, I want a trade war. Donald Trump said, I want a system that works for America, which is not the same as saying, I want to go to war with people over trade and take all their business away. The trade war has really become this kind of emblematic thing about tariffs. None of us cared about tariffs, but now tariffs are literally like the Salem witch trials. If you use the word tariffs, then you're a witch and you should be burned at the stake. The reality is Biden actually had more tariffs than Trump had in his term. So tariffs are not something that Americans never done. And Trump talks a lot about tariffs, but we've seen lots of foot and gas on the brake, and we had tariffs, and then they're pushed off, and then they don't happen, and then they're going to go up, and they go down. So it's very clear that it is a messaging tool. It's very clear that it's a negotiating tool, but it's not clear that it is the overwhelming driving thing in the economy. And then we all talk like tariffs somehow drive the entire global economy, and they don't. And the last thing I'll say is, the people that I don't see get really excited about this? Mostly business people. And the reason is business people know how to deal with tariffs. They know when they need a warehouse, they know when they move things around, and they adjust to these problems all the time. It's a big thing in the media, it's a big thing in conferences, but I'm not sure this talk of tariffs is really driving crisis in the global economy the way Charlie thinks it's going to.
Yeah, I mean, it is arguable, and I know Max wants to come in, and I know that Charlie wants to respond, but it is arguable that business people in general want to know what they're dealing with. They want some predictability in the regulatory environment. They want some predictability in other respects. And people are feeling, anyway, that's just a sense I get in Brussels. I don't want to insert too much of myself into this, Max, please.
No, I think just on that, I think Trump may not want a trade war, but the question is, will he get one? And I think one of the major things that we're seeing from the Trump administration is an effort to use the security relationship that the U.S. has, especially with Europe and others, as leverage on the economic side. But what I see from this administration is not necessarily an integrated, coordinated strategy. So there is planning, I think, taking place in the Pentagon about force reductions that the U.S. is going to do in Europe. At the same time, the U.S. then will say to the Europeans, you must relent and not do counter tariffs back because of the security relationship, because you are dependent on our security umbrella. So it doesn't really work when you're then going to pull back the leverage that you have. It'd be one thing, I think, if the United States was to say, okay, we'll maintain our troop presence, we sort of accept the kind of state of European defense spending is never going to be what we want, but you need to give us something, whether it's on the Digital Services Act, whether it's on trade and tariffs. But that's not the kind of bargain that I see. I don't see a deal being proposed or being had. And so I think what we're going to potentially have is sort of stumbling into conflicts like we're potentially seeing with the Canadians. Now, it's very unclear what will happen there, but I think from a business investment environment, you don't know if you're going to have tariffs that are going to enable investing in an aluminum factory in the U.S. make sense, or will there be some deal cut, or some company will then come give money to the Trump orbit, and then therefore you can, the tariffs will go away. So what, do you make that major investment when you need tariffs for that to be economically competitive? So I don't know if we're going to get the economic potential and benefit from a manufacturing renaissance in the United States, which I think Trump is sort of after, if it goes hand in hand with constantly pulling those back. So,
Charlie.
Yeah, I mean, obviously neither of us knows. We're both making predictions, and we'll see how things unfold in the next few years. But from my perspective, the idea that somehow Trump is going to improve the lives of working Americans, and I completely agree with you, that's the core mandate and the core challenge through tariffs and through rebuilding the manufacturing sector. I don't see it. I mean, George in his opening remarks, and Peter, you mentioned this, we've gone through a revolution from the industrial age to the digital age, and it's automation that has taken jobs from the manufacturing sector, and they're not going to go back to the production line, those Americans, right? 85% of the American workforce is in the service sector. We may see a production line open here and a production line open there, But what we really ought to be doing is training Americans for the jobs of the future, not lying to them that we're going to get back their jobs of the past. And if you really want to make America great again, why are you cutting spending for basic research? Why do you want to close the education department when our public school system and our university system is in some ways the crown jewel that led to American growth? So I completely agree with you on the objectives. It just seems to me that at least in his initial steps, the Trump administration seems to want to take the United States back to the 1950s or maybe the 19th century, and it ain't going to work.
Peter.
Well, I was just going to say that I think in areas where the Trump administration thinks that Brussels has weak to no competencies, they'll mostly ignore Brussels. And in areas where they think they have to go through the commission, they will. So just to give you one example of that, when Kaja Kallas came to Washington, she had already arrived in Washington, and Secretary Rubio, for scheduling reasons, was unable to meet with her. But Maros Lefkovich, when he was in town, Sefcovic met with Howard Lutnick at length, and I think even had a private dinner at the end of his stay. So whether you're the trade commissioner or the foreign policy chief matters quite a bit in that dynamic. I do think that the Trump administration is capable of issue linkage. It wants to fundamentally recast the transatlantic relationship, and so it's looking at all components of that, from security to trade. And I think you would argue that there's just a lot more slack in the system, so to speak. So you can pull back or reposition or redeploy some forces that you might need for another theater or enablers or critical systems, and at the same time have a productive conversation on trade. They probably wouldn't see that as all that inconsistent, because they're not operating off of the baseline of today. I mean, I think they want to see just a fundamental change, and so that's where they're likely to take it.
Peter, thank you very much. I want to make sure before we end our session that we get a chance for all of you to come in with comments or questions. I have a whole set of things. I'm not going to ask them because I suspect some of them are out there in the audience. But if we could go maybe right over there first. We have a microphone that's going around. It's coming to you. And if I could ask you just to tell us who you are and where you're from, that would be great. And to be quite brief. Thank you.
Hello, my name's John Psaropoulos. I'm Al Jazeera's correspondent in Athens. It's comforting to know that a group of Americans is just as confused about the Trump administration as we are in Europe. An energy question, because that's the subject. I think one can discern a rational basis for one prong of the energy policy, which is the drill, in dominating the global export market. What is the rationale for undoing the green energy transition?
Okay.
Yeah,
please.
I don't think we're confused about Donald Trump. We may disagree, right, but I think Trump is actually pretty transparent and pretty obvious. And so this notion that somehow he doesn't know what he's doing, he doesn't have a plan, he doesn't have a 5-year plan. 5-year plans are stupid, drove the Soviet Union into the ground. Trump and he does have a strategy. And part of the strategy is the enemy gets to the vote. The rest of the world gets a vote. So the notion that I'm going to outline everything exactly I'm going to do in the next 4 years to get a particular outcome is nonsensical. And there is only one decision maker. There are factions in every cabinet. And Trump was actually very careful to make sure that all the voices that helped bring him to power, who felt that they needed a say in Washington, are represented in the cabinet. And that's true. But on the larger questions of foreign policy and energy policy, there is only one voice and a direction, and that is Donald Trump. And I think he's actually been very clear on green energy, which is Trump's belief is that the way to address all your key concerns, whether it's environmental or economic or security, is to ensure that you have as much reliable, affordable, dependable energy in the marketplace as possible. And he sees green transition as a plan which was largely political, which wanted to drive particular outcomes, regardless of whether they had any efficacy or not. Now, I would never say this about this company, because this company actually made decisions based on business, right? They're producing energy that makes economic sense. But a lot of the green transition plan did not. And therefore, it's not surprising it was the first thing that he threw overboard. And it's one of the things globally that he will fight vigorously the most, I think, in the next 4 years.
Okay. Thank you. Maybe just right there and then right here. Please.
Thank you.
Ino.
Thank you, Ian. I am Ino Fentouli, the Executive Director of the Institute of International Relations in Athens. There are two, as we see it in Europe, there are two phases of Trump administration. The one is to say, yes, it's an election as usual, and after 4 years, they will be judged by what they will have achieved, and maybe the other party will come to power. But we have the feeling here in Europe that this is something deeper and stronger as a current in the American public opinion. It is the result of an ultra-conservative trend that has roots in specific influential groups, like the religious groups, for example. So I would like to have your view. Is this an administration as usual, or it will go deeper and will change American politics?
Okay. If you agree, maybe we'll collect a couple, maybe 3, and then come back to you for some thoughts. Please.
Well, thank you very much. I'm Konstantinos Lambropoulos, a fellow in strategy from the Geneva Center for Security Policy. I'd like to ask you about Trump's transactional approach. Do you think is more of an escalate to de-escalate method? And regarding this approach, do you think that the trend in Trump's approach is about compartmentalization in foreign policy? Thank you.
Okay. Maybe we take one more, and then we can come back to our group. Or even right now, come back to you on that. One question about structural or ephemeral compartmentalization. Charlie.
I would say that I'm reluctant to interpret this election as a fundamental realignment in American politics that is long-lasting. I think what we're witnessing across many democracies is the difficulty in winning an election if you're an incumbent. And that's because all of our voters are unhappy. And I think they're all unhappy for the same reason, and that is a combination of the difficulty in making ends meet economically and immigration. And those two issues are sort of playing differently on the two sides of the Atlantic, but they are basically at the heart of electoral discontent. And so I think that Trump rode that wave, and the natural disposition of American politics will be to shift back in the other direction, which is exactly what we've seen since Clinton, right? We've got Clinton, and then George W., and then Obama, and then Trump, and Biden, and Trump, and we all have whiplash, and I think this will probably continue. The one caveat that I would offer is that we are seeing unusual things happen, whether it is when it comes to overstepping presidential authority, when it comes to dismissing a corruption case against the New York mayor without any apparent legal justification, when it comes to deportations that, at least according to some judges, overstep American law. And we've seen in Hungary and in Turkey and in other democracies that once you go past a certain point, it's very hard to recover. Will the United States go past that point during the Trump administration? We don't know.
Okay. Max, please.
I think just to extend on what Charlie just said, I think, American politics, the historical norm is actually not for us to have a 50-50 electorate. It's usually for one party to sort of be on top. Think Germany with the CDU winning, every 3 out of 4 elections, and then the SPD comes and governs. And so usually it's 60-40, 55-45. And what's been sort of odd over the last 25 years is that it's been so 50-50. And so the question is something going to break and shift one way? You could look at Trump's election, and I think the electorate within that voted for Trump is sort of divided on this. I think on the one hand, there are those that kind of voted for the revolution, the disruption that I think is occurring in the first 2.5 months, that is very committed to kind of a new order, a new day. And I think a large segment that voted for him looked at the Trump first term, thought the economy was doing pretty well. Yeah, there was a lot of scandals, but actually things were fine. And basically wanted kind of a small c conservative administration where not much changes, maybe a little bit less on the DEI, social cultural stuff, but really just kind of wanted a steady administration. I don't think they're getting that. And so the question now is then what emerges from this politically? Does this lead to kind of an enduring MAGA majority, or does this lead to a real backlash that maybe breaks that 50-50 in the other direction? I think that's really up in the air politically. And then maybe just quickly on Trump's transactional style, I think the big thing that is challenging for allies is that the security relationship, the way I see it, was on a separate track from the economic and energy conversations. Maybe not even a separate track. It was a separate track covered in a tunnel. And you never really intertwine those discussions. And now everything is entangled, everything is intertwined. And that is how that then is a combustible mix, I think, is the real question of how this evolves.
I think Chris DeMuth, who was once a colleague of mine at Hudson Institute, now is at the Heritage Foundation. Jim says he stole him. Once said to me, politics never really goes back. And I think that's true. At least in short sort of cycles, you tend to have something new or a new iteration follow the old. Over the long sort of run of history, you do have similar trends reemerge. But I just don't think that what is coming next is going to be, as I mentioned in my opening comments, a return to the Democratic Party or the Republican Party of old necessarily. And one manifestation of that is we don't have a traditional left-right spectrum the way we once did. It's much more now of an urban-rural divide. And if we think of politics on the right as the three-legged stool that Reagan identified of national security hawks, social conservatives, and economic free marketeers, there are different elements interspersed there. So I think a lot of the religious groups that were referenced in the question supported President Trump because they saw the left on social and cultural issues as careening way outside of the mainstream of what traditionally has been American culture and Americana, from wokeism to kind of the hedonism of the day in a way. And they associated that, a collapse in religiosity, for example, with the left. And it isn't that they thought Donald Trump is this pious man who can recite vast passages from the Bible, but he would stand in front of your church with a pitchfork and keep those coming for religious freedoms in America at bay. And so, there is this kind of, I think, we can call it real serious kind of stringent conservatism in the cultural stool. But like on the economic front, for example, there is little to no appetite for dramatic entitlement reform, which was an animating force in the second George W. Bush administration. So there are changes afoot there. On the transactional approach, I just want to say very quickly, I think this defines President Trump and the Trump administration in that there is little memory of the past. So I do think when it comes to Europe, President Trump has real affinity for Great Britain, and he also has a seeming liking for President Macron. He appreciates the defense spending of the Eastern Europeans, the Poles in particular. Secretary Hegseth made that clear. But by and large, I don't think he's allowing the scoreboard to carry over from past decades. He's not going to look at an ally or a partner and say, you were with us, in this enterprise or in that endeavor. Instead, I think it's a transaction now. How is this or that initiative, this or that attempt helping advance the interests of the United States? And that's how I think allies have to think when approaching the White House.
Peter, thank you very much. I'm conscious of our time, and we will have a brief coffee break afterwards, but I wanted to ask you the most expressive questions as we go around, literally take 10 seconds or 20 each. wild card. Give us a wild card. Something that could surprise us and interrupt the kind of trajectories we've been talking about in different ways here. Charlie.
I'm going to think while James.
Oh my God, that's not very fair.
Yeah, come on, you go first.
I'm the one the most.
All right, no, all right, I have a solution.
I get the most time.
No, Peter, you go first.
Well, this is almost cliched because it's a wild card that's often discussed, but you could see the Chinese either crossing an American red line in our treaty commitments with the Philippines or taking the leap across the Taiwan Straits. Not that I think those are necessarily likely, but those would be truly world historic, earth-shattering type of events.
Max.
I think transatlantic relations is going to go through an incredibly rough patch over the next year. And I think it's going to get so bad that we're not sure that we can repair it. And I think that's everything from Greenland to trade to tech fights over Twitter and I think troop withdrawals. And I think it's all going to get entangled. But the wild thought is that Europe actually comes out of this in some ways stronger, and it may be actually beneficial to Europe in the long run.
Eurobonds.
James.
No, I actually agree. I actually think Europe's going to emerge from this stronger, definitely on the security front. And I actually think the pressure from Trump is going to drive a lot of economic reforms in Europe. That's going to make Europe more competitive. So I'm actually bullish on Europe, so I would buy Europe.
Okay. Charlie, last word.
We haven't mentioned Ukraine, so maybe I'll end with that.
Oh, why not?
I think that it's in some ways a good litmus test of Trump in the sense that I support his effort to negotiate an end to the war. It hasn't been handled in the most effective way. And we're getting to a crucial moment now where Trump is, he really wants a deal, but he's going to need to put pressure on Putin to get a deal that Ukraine and that Europe can live with. And I think this will be a real test of, number one, his commitment to the transatlantic relationship. Is he going to listen to Europeans and listen to Ukrainians and get a deal that leaves 80% of Ukraine standing and secure? Or will he say, I negotiated a good deal, Ukraine and Europe walked away from it, and now it's their problem? I am cautiously optimistic. I land where my colleagues land, which is, I think that the transatlantic relationship will emerge from this period intact. So be patient. Don't write us off. We will stick around.
Look at this optimistic.
No, this is completely unplanned. Charlie, thank you. Thank you all. This has really been a terrific conversation, a terrific way to start us off. Please join me in thanking our speakers. We're going to come back in 15 minutes to talk about connectivity and innovation. Thanks so much.
If you could do that on no sleep, what do you like when you...
I missed Eurobonds. I know, it's the first
Ladies and gentlemen, please find your seats. The second session will start soon.
Massimo, hi.
Here we are.
Va bene.
Κοιτάω από εκεί. Α.
Interesting times.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. We are back to our shores, and after an all-American panel, an all-European panel here with us, I am very happy, actually, that we come back to Europe to discuss what this, you can call it a Trump shock therapy, will do for the European ability to once again become a strategic thinker. We have a great panel. It's a fantastic mix along the north-south connectivity route, if you wish. So Massimo De Andres, who is a General Director of Economic Research Center of Intesa Sao Paulo. Adrian Kondasiewski, I hope I have read it perfectly, okay. Director of International Affairs in the Ministry of Climate and Environment in Poland, and Poland is current presidency of the European Council. And we have Alex Paterakis, who is Deputy CEO of Public Power Corporation. So a great mix, an essential mix for connectivity of government, finance, and private sector. We will have 60 minutes. We will have short introductions. I will then just follow up with one round of questions and open to the public. As I said, we will focus on Europe, and particular on European energy sector, as I would say a key pillar of security and competitiveness in the current environment. But also I want us to look a bit ahead. Europe is a 20 trillion economy, but is often not, you don't feel the strength of it. So very often people characterize European Union as being very rich and very weak. Very weak because of the fragmentation, overregulation, complacency, lack of strategic nerve. Is this true? And if yes, how do we change it? We will start with Massimo, who will help us with the big picture, geopolitics of energy, and where is Europe at this moment?
Thank you very much, first of all. Thank you very much for having me. So I think that the first point for Europe, but also in terms of general outlook of energy geopolitics, is to look at energy dependence. If we look at Europe, we have an average of 58% of energy dependence. That means that we need 100% and we have to import 58%. And this is an average between countries like mine that has more than 70% and countries like France, 40% due to nuclear power plant. So a large dependence. If we look at China, China has 20% of energy import, which is far less than Europe. And if we look at United States are totally independent. That doesn't mean that they have import and export, of course. This is the market flows. But they are fully independent for fossil fuels. I think this is the key point that we have to start. We have to lower the level of dependence of Europe. And I think this is also something related to what we heard in the previous discussion, why the Trump administration decided as one of the first decisions to stop Green Deal. I think that the answer is because they are, as I said, totally independent for fossil fuels, but they are not totally independent for critical raw materials. If we look at cobalt, nickel, rare earth, United States is not fully independent. So moving forward, from a US perspective, moving forward, fossil energy situation, I mean supply, to renewables, one, Green Deal, was, in this perspective, to moving forward an independent situation to a potentially dependence, because we know that for critical raw materials, China is leading. So there is sense in the Trump administration to leave the Green Deal. But this is also the reason why Europe should not leave the Green Deal, because for Europe to move toward the implementation of renewables is a way to lower the level of dependence. And here I come to my second point. We have to implement, of course, I know that, for example, in the last 20 years, Europe moved from 15% to 45% of green energy production. I mean, it's a good improvement, but it's totally not enough. We can implement more. We have to implement more. We all agree about that. But we should also know that for how many solar plants and wind plants we will put inside the European Union, covering all the lands, we will not reach anyway the full independence. So the only way is also to import green energy and to import green hydrogen. So the question is where we can import green hydrogen, where we can import green energy. There is only a place, is the North African countries and the MENA region. There are no other places. And new technology still give us the possibility to import. For example, you know, the power-to-gas technology, you can produce energy with a solar plant, then to transform this green energy in synthetic gas and to blend it in the existing pipelines or with new grid connection. So my final point is that we have to move as European, I mean, from the European perspective. If we look at the dialogue, at the energetic dialogue that we had in the past 15 years with the North African countries was a typical trade relation. We buy oil and gas, we give money, and we buy oil and gas. By the way, giving money to the elite of these countries was not a way to support their development. And we have to switch this dialogue from fossil to green in terms of a new cooperation with these countries, because it's possible to produce solar, to produce wind, to produce green hydrogen. By the way, in many of these countries, Morocco has its own hydrogen strategic plan. Egypt present their own strategic plan for hydrogen in the last COP in Sharm el-Sheikh, and so on. So, these countries are moving in this direction, and this is the only way for Europe. A new cooperation with these countries, which is also a way to help these countries to develop their own economy, because, and this is in an opposite side to what it was the case for fossil fuel, if under a solar plant in Egypt or a wind plant in Morocco, there are technologies, there is maintenance need, there is the need to form engineers, there is the need to implement farms over there. It's a way to develop cooperation, but also to help development in these countries. So the only way for Europe is to support the green dialogue, and this is especially true for Italy and also for Greece. For the countries which are front and where the existing connection, I think to the pipelines, I think to the grid connection with these countries is the way to support Europe, but in a win-win approach, which is also useful for these countries. This is something that EU has to implement more, because there is a lack of view in terms, I know that there are some imperatives, questions on the Balkans and on the east side, but Europe should also look at the Mediterranean as its own lake in a certain way, to build a new partnership. And the only way to build a new partnership, economic partnership, is to leverage with energy cooperation.
Great, thanks a lot. Indeed, Mediterranean has become a Central European sea yet again, after many, I would say even decades. We will move now to Adrian, and I'm very happy that we have this north-south mix here. You are privy to institutional discussions, as Poland is the presidency, and really would love to hear from you what is the institutional take and what are the key issues, both on the level of national government but also institutions in Brussels, when it comes to the energy resilience, when it comes to reducing dependencies, as we just heard, but also the ideas of basically what can be described as nearshoring green energy. And that brings many other dimensions as well. But just to get a sense of how institutions are thinking about that, are they thinking deep enough? Are they thinking wide enough? And are they thinking quick enough? Please.
Thanks a lot, Romana, and many thanks to GMF for inviting me. It's a privilege to be here. Indeed, you're right. This issue of energy security is very high at the political agenda, and I'm coming almost directly from Brussels with a quick stopover in Warsaw, where we had last week the first Environment Council under a Polish presidency, so the meeting at the ministers' level, and then the week before we had Energy Council, where we discussed all of those issues that you, Romana, and also Massimo mentioned. So dependency, energy security, this competitiveness of European economy. And I'm happy to share a couple of takeaways from those discussions that I think can perfectly fit to our discussion here today. First takeaway from those discussions is that the need for diversification and energy security, it's almost every member state is concerned about that. You know that we are at very turbulent times, and the need to secure our resources is basically a very crucial. And I agree with Massimo that the focus will shift at some point to renewables, or is shifting as we speak. But for still many years to come, European countries will need fossil fuels. And the idea to find reliable suppliers is out there. We, of course, as presidency, we try to propose to other member states to cut dependencies on those suppliers that are unreliable, and mainly Russia, because this is a huge issue for many Central and Eastern European countries. And we, of course, are aware of those sensitivities among different countries when it comes to relations with Russia and bringing gas and oil from that direction. But as a first step, we propose to those countries to get rid of Russian LNG. That should be a pretty low-hanging fruit, especially that the market conditions that we are approaching right now are very favorable to do that. We know that there are many more suppliers ready to ship LNG gas to Europe. There are new liquefaction facilities that are being opened this year and in the coming years. That should lower the pressure on prices globally and could bring some benefits to the European Union. So we propose to those countries, let's get rid of Russian LNG and try to sign contracts with other, more reliable suppliers. The second issue that was very much mentioned during those meetings was the case for protecting energy infrastructure. You probably are aware of the fact that we had multiple examples of damages to gas and electricity infrastructure in the Baltic Seas, which are currently under investigation. But those events are not only limited to the Baltic Sea region. We had 1 week ago a huge fire of the substation in the London Heathrow that completely paralyzed the airport for 2 days. So that should make us think of how to protect better our energy infrastructure. And since we are trying to electrify more and more sectors and to build more and more grids to supply those sectors and to supply end consumers, we are creating the conditions where we are more and more vulnerable to those attacks and damages to our electricity infrastructure. So we should, as Europe, think of how together better monitor those hugely important pieces of infrastructure, how to repair it fastly whenever there's damages, and how to make the whole system more resilient. And the third issue that I would like to mention, there were many points raised during those meetings, but the third issue that I wanted to raise over here was the prices of electricity. You know that this is a huge political issue. It's a concern in many member states, and particularly in this region. Greece, you know that also with other countries from this southeastern part of Europe, suffered a very high electricity prices last year from, George could correct me, but from July to September, Greece, Romania, Bulgaria, and others, Hungary, for example, had more than 100 hours of electricity prices above 300 euros per megawatt hour. And that's extraordinary prices. And there were two reasons for that. One was the lack of electricity connection to other regions, and second was lack of capacities. So we, as Polish presidency, we tried to promote the idea of investing to capacity mechanism in the at the regional level, so that multiple countries can come together and found and spend money on capacities that could be used whenever there's a price spikes. Our analysis suggests that if countries of the southeastern Europe had those capacities in place last year, they could have saved a lot of money. So the three takeaways from my side. Many thanks.
Thanks a lot. And we are finalizing this first round with Alex. I think it's absolutely clear there is no strong geopolitical Europe without strong European private sector. And that is something that everyone in Brussels should keep in mind at all times. As private sector that is of great importance for ultimately the stability and competitiveness of Europe, what would you say are sort of the key elements that you need from institutions? What kind of thinking, what kind of instruments, what kind of doing would be of essence for you to be able to do your job properly and in return make all of us safer and growing?
So first of all, let me thank GMF and CSIS for this great pleasure to be here. Again, we represent sort of the private sector, so we need to sort of make ourselves profitable for ourselves, our shareholder, and our customers through these turbulent times. So for us, what's very important is to look out where is that value for us. So I keep hearing a few terms, for example, disruption. For us, disruption means opportunity. There's something in there for us. We hear security. Greater security. For us, there's growth. You heard a few points in the opening remarks of our chairman. What we want to do, and how do we start the dialogue, is by clearly articulating our vision, our agenda, a strategy, our points. We want to make sure and clear to everyone how is it that we are going to attain what we've been set upon us to do, which is become clearly the #1 power tech in Southeast Europe. For us, energy and technology, and should I say digital technology, are in sort of intertwined situation. They are coupled. So electrons and sort of binary digits are, in today's sense, one and the same. Putting this into perspective, if you look at some of the reports, you'll see quotes that almost 3% of all of EU energy will be going to data centers. We need those data centers in order to run our business. How do we achieve what we want? Efficiently managing renewable assets, having a more intelligent grid, being able to have that level of flexibility. There's no way we can do that without technology. Technology today means more energy in the form of data centers. So how do we sort of address this paradox? Are we going to build more and in the process crash the networks? Or are we not going to build and not have enough of what we need to basically formulate an end state in this transition? So for us, I think here is part of the opportunity. We're looking at capturing part of that DC, data center market in Europe. We feel that's integral to our success, to our nations in these regions that we operate, and clearly for our consumers. Let me take on the final point that you mentioned. He said very clearly, we face some very extreme cases in the cost of energy. One of the very simple ways that we could manage that is if we had that flexibility in place. Well, yes, you can consider a data center at scale will allow for that flexibility to be in place. So can we produce the amount of renewable energy that we need to drive that data center? Yes. Is that data center up and running? Will it provide that flexibility? Yes. So clearly we can see, for example, that having the relevant infrastructure in place in the right green scalable matter, we could achieve that transition. More green, more technology, more sustainable energy for people. And as a final point, I think a lot of people are concerned about how do we reduce energy, or how do we reduce prices in energy, or how do we do more greener. I think these all go hand in hand. For us, we don't necessarily think that deploying data centers in a normal situation where we just outbuild, which by default need more energy, and moreover, they eat the cheaper energy, because in order for those data centers to be profitable, they need the cheaper energy, which inadvertently drives prices up for consumers. So for us, data center is not a one-way street, it is a two-way street. It has to be integrated into the network, and in our case, what we call behind the meter. So it means that the data center and the energy required to drive it should be facilitated behind the meter. It should not inflict pressure on the grid, and it should not put pressure on prices. This way, we feel this is a sustainable and profitable and makes business sense. So this, for example, is one of those strategies that we are applying in order for us to go forward.
Okay, thanks a lot. I'm now going to go just very quickly with one more round of quicker questions, but I want to pose one question for the very end, and I want you to think about that. The last panel finished with a conclusion that I would personally fully subscribe to, that Europe will get out of the current situation with the US stronger. And once that partnership gets rebalanced again, Europe will be at a better place. But how do we get there? So I would like at the very end, if you will, just think of one sentence, one word, something short which you think is, I can't say a golden bullet, but something that would be the most important element for European Union to do in order to build that strength. Let me just do 3 quick questions now, because we want to do a follow-up on something along the lines of competitiveness, security, and growth, because I think these were the 3 sort of pieces of discussion here. Massimo, I'll start with you. Very often we are discussing this in boxes. You know, energy is discussed in energy, transportation discussed in transportation, etc. But this is not how the world operates. So if you can just give us a very sort of short thinking on how do we think about this connectivity issue in a comprehensive way. What are the pieces that are absolutely needed for us to be able to, you know, move European Union on this to the next step?
I come to your question, but let me come back one moment to 2 key words that I heard. One is connectivity, and the other is diversification. Yeah. So, and then I come to the point, because both are related. In Europe, it's clear we need to invest more in connectivity, internal connectivity, which is also a way to have a more effective and fluid market, but also to invest more in linking Europe with external, out of European countries. It was what I was talking about before when I said we need to have a new relation with North African countries. The second key word is diversification. You are totally right, I fully agree. We will need for a decade at least to still import, because Europe does not have fossil energy, especially gas. But diversification means to also import LNG, because it's important to also for gas to have a diverse import. The one with pipelines, which means Algeria, for example, it's for sure, or it was the case of Russia before. I mean, one country over the others, but LNG means a plurality of different markets, and also US imports. but also to invest in synthetic gas, hydrogen, I mean green, renewables, and so on. And then I come to the point, what can mix all together, but also what can mix the key point of data centers. And not because we are here, I mean, in front of the Piraeus, but I really think that the key points are ports. Ports. I mean, also the European Union, the European Commission should think in another way, because we still think that ports are the place where people and goods are moving, which is true, of course, but not yet only that. Ports are powerful energy hubs. Why I'm saying so? If I look Italian ports, Greek ports, but also in the north of Europe, ports are the place where pipeline arrives. Ports are the place where, for example, chemical industry is based, and chemical industry is one industry that should move toward green plant production for biofuel, for example. Ports are the place where LNG is based. Ports are the place where there is land enough also to produce green energy, also for supporting the shipping industry decarbonization. Ports are the place where it's possible because there is land, and also because sea is a place to refresh data center easily. So it are the place where you can base data centers. So I think that ports in a certain way are the place where we can mix all these EU energy strategy. And believe me, I'm telling that not from the angle of a think tank, because yes, I'm managing a think tank, but the think tank is the think tank of the first Italian bank, and since 3 weeks ago, the first EU bank for capitalization. We have 14 banks, subsidiary banks abroad, many in the Mediterranean area, also in North Africa, also in European countries like Croatia or Slovenia or Albania, so Mediterranean countries. And what we see is that the ports are crossing these sectors. We have a lot of business around ports. Also, if we look, for example, I'm closing on that point, on free zones. Free zones is our place to attract industry. So we are talking about industry, manufacturing, but these free zones are more powerful when are close to ports, because exactly for that reason, because are at the connection between energy and geoeconomics. I don't want to talk about geopolitics, but I can talk about geoeconomics.
Thanks a lot. Also, I guess a message that then Europe should keep its ports for itself.
I mean, ports are the place, symbolic in a certain way of also of the market. So the point is not the property of the ports, but the ability to deliver the strategy of Europe through the ports. Then the property, is like an airport. You can have a private property, but the point is who is leading the policy of that.
Okay, great. So you said strategy of Europe. I'm coming back to you, Adrian, with a question. A lot of what we have discussed today at the panel has been discussed around Europe at many occasions. And I think, diversification, connectivity, de-risking, all these concepts are well understood. And I think the analysis of this is also well understood. But how do we move from understanding all of this and understanding what Europe needs to do to Europe actually doing it? Is there, in your experience, is there, or how do we create some kind of a central brain that will compute all of this and come with a very concrete plan on how do we do it. Very concrete instruments that are simple, that are clear, that are at scale, that you can use at speed, that you can really be strategic. Because, you know, it's not, and this is unfortunately what very often happens with many documents, and we are among friends in Europe, is people put the word strategy on a paper and they think it's strategy. No, unless you have a very concrete idea how to implement. So this is what I want to hear. Is there a bit more mature understanding and planning? How do we do this?
Well, that's a very easy question. I have a feeling that it's always been like that, right? I mean, to regulate something or to enact a bill, it takes some time. And in case of European Union, it's even more difficult because there are 27 member states that have to agree on something. But I guess the political direction has been set a couple of years ago. And if we go back to the points that I raised, for example, so when it comes to diversification, there is a political decision to get rid of Russian fossil fuels in 2027. And now we are working on subsequent steps that will ultimately get us to that point. So, for example, right now we are in contact and in discussion with other member states and the European Commission on banning Russian LNG into our market, and hopefully this will happen by the end of our presidency, so by the end of June. When it comes to the protection of critical energy infrastructure, there are also concrete proposals and projects on the table that we are trying to discuss with other member states. For example, there's an understanding among member states that we have to protect our grids. And right now, we are talking about financing the protection of those grids from the EU budget, so that it doesn't increase the tariffs that the end consumers eventually pay. So this is like a concrete way forward to protect our energy infrastructure. And on the third element that I raised before, so the prices and how can we like work together in the regions to try to lower those price spikes. I think over there are also concrete proposals, and actually Poland is one of the countries which could be a good example, because we are trying to run capacity auctions at the regional level, so that, for example, other countries can have their own capacities that could serve our needs. And similar projects can be then developed in other regions. So there are a handful of concrete steps forward.
Okay, great. And thank you for mentioning European budget. Europe can talk whatever it wants. Budget is the Bible. So what is in the budget is going to happen. So it's of crucial importance that all of these discussions now are happening before the final decisions on the budget. I go back to you, Alex, with the growth question. Growth through diversification, growth through innovation. And I want you to look at the Mediterranean at large. We haven't mentioned it yet today, but IMEC, India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor has a very important energy dimension. The North-South, so the proper sort of southern route towards Africa, etc. If you can just, from, again, perspective of the private sector, tell us how important this larger dimension is for you, for growth, both of the company and the European energy sector as well.
So clearly, from a geographical perspective, Greece is where it is. It's at the southeastern tip of Europe, and it's in the middle of the crossroads that, as you mentioned before, whether it's North Africa or Middle East. I think at this point in time, there's no going back. Integration or connectivity, as we mentioned before, will have to happen at this level. So today, obviously, there are a number of projects ongoing. Some are in the space of electrons, so we have cables to interconnect countries so that we can carry cheaper, faster, more, let's say, green energy. But at the same time, it also is becoming a sort of telecommunication hub. So we've got a lot more underwater sea fiber connecting Europe with those regions. I think, again, it's part of that relationship where we will need to structure with those regions, which should not be only on one facet. Again, if you look, I'm advocating for the integrated relationship. So there are a number of things that we used to do. You mentioned very well trade. Now it has to be a much tighter relationship. We will give, they will take, and vice versa. So we think that, our geography can play a major role becoming a hub, and we can address through the ports as well, LNG and so on and so forth. Furthermore, we can serve as a conduit, as a corridor going into Southeastern Europe. This will also, I believe, play an important role. I think in the previous panel there was also mention about Ukraine. There is an ongoing dialogue as to what's next for Ukraine. Ukraine will have significant demands, both in terms of energy, connectivity, data, you name it. This will actually stress Europe even further as Ukraine will go into its rebuilding phase. Clearly, this part can play a major role. And I'd want to go back to your sort of original point, which said, what could we ask? What would we do? What would we ask, for example, Europe? I think the first element, as I mentioned before, is we have to be very crystal clear as to what we want to do. I think there's a lot of consensus. We know what we need to do. There's agreement in the items. I think budget aspects have been addressed, or at least are in the final stage of address. I think one aspect that we need to bring into all of the discussions is time. It's the only thing we do not have. We are under immense pressure. One, obviously, by the geopolitical aspects that we discussed earlier in the panel, but also as we progress, society needs more in all of these aspects. So I think what's important is we need to understand that we would never be able to solve all problems on an equal measure at the same time, and we need to move. So I think it's a point where we need to take some decisions. We're going to have to cut some things loose. We cannot address them to the level that we would like. We would need to think around those solutions, because obviously those will create problems or they will leave issues unattended for on the table. So how do we put some mitigation actions around them? But I think the most important aspect is, and we hear this a lot, is Europe still is attempting to address its own needs. I think Europe should look beyond its borders. I think it's an integral part. It's a very large economy at the global stage. It has a lot to offer. Obviously, it needs a lot. So I think we should not forget that we need to thread within the dialogue of what is it that we need to address our needs. How can we be more integrated? How could we play a more major role in this geopolitical environment, whether it's the energy security itself or digital connectivity? So I think here, that strengthening of our relationship across neighboring countries is what we could achieve.
Great, thanks a lot. And I take that urgency and the need to have clear priorities as something that is not, the usual reflection of European politics. So that is something which is important to remember. Ian, how much longer do we have? Oh, give us 7. I just wanted to open. I just wanted to open for the questions from the public. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Jacek Krawczyk, and I represent the European Economic Social Committee, but also I'm a vice chair of the Polish Confederation of Private Employers, which is quite relevant to your debate. First comment, I think we have to be able to count our blessings. I think the transformation Europe made in the last decades is incredible. I do want to bring an example of our country, which is, I was a state secretary in the government in 1991. Our dependence on Russia was 100%. Today is almost none. So I think we have to be able to look at the whole thing in a perspective. But I believe that we haven't touched much about the issue of energy as a real ingredient of the security policy, because it is indeed a part of the security approach that Europe is now discussing in a very comprehensive way. But now, as an employee representative, I just want to ask a very simple question. What we have to do to bring the prices of energy down? Because without this, our economy, our businesses will not be competitive. I mean, we are not magicians. We cannot make our product services competitive if prices of energy will continue to be at these levels. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. We'll take 2 more questions. Okay. And we'll come back to you, don't worry. Yes, please.
Any option? Yeah, my question is, nuclear power, is it an option that we should consider as Europeans, assuming a high standard of safety and production?
Thanks a lot. And then there's a question here.
My name is George Plevis. I'm a strategy and foresight manager from Growth Fund. Our chairman of the board just asked a question as well. My question focuses a bit, I would like the opinion of the speakers about the executive act that President Trump signed 20th of March that kind of pushes the minerals policy in the US, redirecting it to internal and domestic, accelerating and make it more critical, and labeling countries, competitive countries that go toe-to-toe with the US as hostile. How this will signal towards allies, Europe, or how will this make more competitive the policies that we have when it comes to minerals and critical minerals? Thank you.
Okay, great. So security, nuclear power as a possibility to have abundance of power, and mineral policy. There are a million other things that can be discussed, but let's try to finish with this. And whoever wants to, I think maybe on security, you can answer, and then we will.
There was a question on security and prices, I guess, right?
Yes.
So I don't know how much time do you have. But
you have 2 seconds.
No.
Yeah.
Okay, so on prices in 2 seconds, all right. No, obviously there are no easy fixes, right? To have cheap electricity. But I will tell you maybe on what we try to do during our time at the helm of the European Council, which we would like to focus on 3 elements when it comes to the prices. First, the taxes, and because the bill for end consumers is includes to a very large extent the tax in it. So we would like to limit the taxes in the bills for the electricity users. The second issue is networks. We would like to make sure that the tariffs are not too high, so that it also feeds into the bills, which could be lower thanks to that. And the third element is working on capacities, because if you don't have capacities, you will face with those price spikes, which can damage your budget overall. So working on that 3 elements, I think, is crucial and manageable.
Who wants to take the minerals?
Not especially minerals, but I try to reply to all briefly.
Okay,
Briefly. Price, I think I agree with you, but I think that at least in the medium run, the key point is a better connectivity among European markets. And so with more grids. For example, if you have extra production in Spain, you cannot use to leverage the market in Italy, because Spain and Italy are not connected. So a more integrated connection, I mean, between grids, electricity grid in Europe, is a way to let the market of the different countries to be more efficient and to lowering the price. Nuclear power can be an option, especially micro nuclear powers, but we need, experts say, I'm not an expert, we need at least 10 years. So it's not for tomorrow. Raw materials, I don't know the effect of the Trump administration decision on minerals, but my key points is that Europe must look as fundamental points critical raw materials for energy. I mean, what I said before, cobalt, for example, nickel, and so on, because especially as far as Europe has to move to a higher production of renewables, we should look at this as a strategic point, because otherwise we move from an energy dependence to a critical raw materials dependence, which is the key issue of electricity also for batteries and for all, I mean, also in the car industry is the same problem. I mean, we are not talking about car industry now, but if we want to discuss about the problem of car industry right now, it's something strictly related with energy decision. And raw materials, of course.
So I think to attempt to provide a silver bullet for the price decrease in energy, I don't think anybody has that answer today. But clearly, the attributes are there. One, we have to build more of renewable. That's happening at a scale in Europe which hasn't happened before. Can we do more? Yes. Are we going to be doing more? I believe so. So that, in terms of building out infrastructure to generate that energy, and we're talking mainly in the renewable space, is happening. Second is what we mentioned before. Do we have access to the relevant capital to do the investments in the grid? The more interconnection, as also Massimo mentioned, the more flexibility we'll have across the countries and the grids to share the energy. Is it going to happen tomorrow? No. Is it very far away? No. It's a process that we have to go through. It's something that's going to take a bit of time to happen, but I think all of the ingredients are there. Obviously, as I mentioned before, time, we would like to have more, we don't, but I think it's something that's being addressed, and I think it'll happen. Now, on the subject of nuclear, I think SMRs, I think what Massimo said is probably clear. There's going to be a role for them to play in Europe. How much and how quickly, we don't know. Again, it has to do with the specialties of nuclear. I think on the raw materials, it is something that we all, that Europe needs to be conscious about. It mainly has to be, it's an integral factor for the industry who produce material, for potentially companies like us which need it. Today, do we see a shortage of it? No. Do we have access to how much we need? Yes. But clearly, from the security perspective, Europe needs to build out that capacity in the infrastructure to be able to self-sufficient to a larger extent than it is today, because for now, a lot of that material comes outside of Europe, which poses a security threat.
Thanks a lot. I will close here. It was great. Thank you very much. Also, a little bit for our American friends to see how policy discussion in Europe, in the sort of the framework of the European Union, is done. Thank you very much. I think it's also a good entry point for the next panel. And hope to be able to, not in the far distant future, have a panel exclusively on how. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join your seats. The third and last session of the day will commence.
So in how many ways did your, never mind. These chairs are too easy. I promise, everything you say right now is off the record. Tomas, can you hear us? Check one. Thomas, can you hear us? Oh, yeah, we can hear him too slightly. I can begin. Excellent. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. We are the only thing standing in between you and cocktail hour, dinner, or whatever your evening may hold. So thank you kindly for sticking with us. And those colleagues joining us online, thank you for your kind attention all the way back in Washington, D.C. We've heard a lot today about the shifting nature of the transatlantic relationship, the internal politics of Washington, the politics of Europe when it comes to energy, to market integration. And I'm hoping we get a chance in the next little bit to talk about what these ideas mean specifically for energy. I'm not sure we would be having this conversation here today if not for the crisis that Europe has lived through over the past 3 years. And I've got three people who I think are going to offer really unique and interesting perspectives on the incredible questions that the crisis of the last few years poses for us, the lessons we have learned, and I'd like to have a theme today of turning crisis response into strategy. And what does that really mean, both for Southeast Europe, for the European project generally, and for the rest of the world? So please allow me to welcome Nikos Safos, recently minted Deputy Minister of Energy here in Greece, Thomas Anker Christensen, who now works as a Senior Advisor to the EU Commissioner Dan Jorgensen, joining us online. Thomas, can you do a quick sound check for us, please? Excellent. Welcome, sir. He has a long career as a diplomat with positions at the United Nations, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for Denmark, and was previously the climate ambassador for the country of Denmark as well. And Gabi Mitchell joins us from the Meetvim Institute, but holds positions at Notre Dame and other think tanks and scholarly endeavors. He's an expert on the geopolitics of energy here in the Eastern Med and runs what I can recommend as a highly readable and interesting Substack, Invisible Boundaries. Gentlemen, welcome. Thank you. Nikos, 3 years ago, when we were still colleagues at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, you came to me and you said, I'm leaving. And I was disappointed. And you said, I'm repatriating to Greece because Europe and my country are in a crisis and I feel obligated to help. Since then, you've worked as an advisor to the PM. I know that you've had your fingers in a lot of European energy discussions, and now you have an official role in the government. How did it go? Did you save your country?
Well, first of all, Joseph, can you hear me? No? Okay.
Check your...
Can you hear me now? Oh, I can hear me now. Okay. Well, first of all, welcome to Athens, Joseph.
I'm so pleased to be here.
So glad you could be with us. Listen, the last 3 years have been quite painful for Europe and for Greece. I always like to get the sense of the scale of the challenge we faced in 2022. That if you look historically, Greece spent about 1 billion euros a year importing natural gas. That's sort of the long-term average. In 2022, we spent 7.4 billion, okay? So 7 times increase in the import bill of gas. That was 3.5% of GDP. And so this was an incredibly sort of difficult moment to try to make it through that crisis and protect our consumers and our industry from that massive shock. And so that took effort at the national level, it took effort at the regional level, because obviously this was a regional and European crisis. It also took a lot of action at the European level. And so that phase of sort of my job and the crisis, I would say, was ending by the beginning of 2023, where we sort of left that stage of acute danger and got into something new. The problem is that where we have ended up is not where we were before the crisis and before COVID. So we have still the lingering effects of that energy shock. The gas that Russia took out of the European market, we haven't replaced yet, or the world hasn't replaced yet. If you look at gas prices, you know, we used to have an average of about 20 euros per megawatt. Now we're at 40 plus or minus. If you look at electricity prices, 2019, we're about 45 euros per megawatt. Last year, we're at 80 at the EU level. This past few months, we've been close to 100 and above 100. And so part of the challenge is, you know, you don't have the acute crisis that you had in 2022, but energy costs are still top of mind for businesses, for citizens, for questions of competitiveness. And so the question is, you know, how do you chart an energy transition strategy where you want to go, given the fact that your existing system is still quite fragile, right? And I think that is the challenge that Europe is called to address. You know, if we had slightly or significantly lower energy prices, you know, this would be a totally different challenge, right? Because then we wouldn't necessarily have the pressure, the economic pressure. We would just have sort of the climate pressure. And so the challenge that we face is, on the one hand, we have the climate pressure, but we also have the pressure of energy, costs, and competitiveness. And so a big part of our job as policymakers is, how do you juggle those different things?
Right.
Because the more you do in one way, the more difficult it might be to do something else.
Tomas, I was in Brussels a couple weeks ago, and I think the shock to the system that President Trump has introduced it gave me the impression it's really woken up Brussels about the need to make some pretty drastic reforms, exactly to the issues Nikos was just mentioning. How do we manage affordability? How do we navigate our way out of this, like the sort of, if there was a price shock and now we're at a higher shelf, we need to get back down. And it seems to me that the policy, what we call the Overton window, has really widened, thinking about what a more common financial union will do for investment, thinking about reforming the way that European policy mechanisms work to help deploy clean energy and storage solutions and grid integration to address these challenges. The Commission has come in with a sense of vigor. Can you give us a sense of what 2025 holds in the context of this strategic challenge that Nikos has laid out?
Thanks, Joseph, and thanks for having me at the conference where I couldn't be with you in person. I could, of course, put a very long lecture for the rest of the afternoon on the complex issue you're raising, but let me try to address just a few points. And Nikos is very right to say that energy costs, not only for Greece, but for Europe, shot through the roof in 2022, and still last year were way beyond what they used to be. And that's one of the reasons why the proposal from the European Commission is actually to not backtrack but fast-track the energy transition, because Europe does not have abundant supplies of oil and gas. We import almost everything we have, and therefore investing into renewable energy, energy efficiency, grid improvement will also bring down prices. It's not a silver bullet, but it's a combination of many different actions that are taken together that will bring prices down over the course of this year and the next few years. And in a way, it's sort of a trifecta of energy action, combining increasing energy security, decarbonization, and competitiveness, because the increased speed of the rollout of renewable energy, combined with the energy union that you addressed, the grid expansion, the rollout of interconnectors between European down the network charges, an energy bill that would be a great package coming forward, and an electrification plan, but also as a second step, push to work with the EU member states to lower their national taxes and the electricity costs for consumers in member states. Then also, in addition, to work on the supply costs for the long-term supply contracts, which ultimately we think will help break the link between retail electricity prices and the high and volatile gas prices. But in addition to that, we then need to work on the savings and capital markets union that you alerted to, and we need to sort of solve bottlenecks in the market where supply and demand don't meet, where buyers and sellers don't come together. And the Commission has proposed trying something we call the tripartite mechanism, which is a tool we use a lot in my own home country, Denmark, for solving issues in the market where we need to speed up not market failures, but maybe a slow adjustment of market mechanisms. So all taken together, we believe that we can phase out fossil fuels faster and make savings at the tune of up to 130 billion euros annually by 2030 and 260 billion annually by 2040. In the short term, this will take a lot of action this year and next year, but we are trying to work on that. Then, in addition to Nico's point, we still have a lot of Russian grid. There's a decision by European leaders to work on phasing that out.
Right.
So the next step from Brussels will be a roadmap on Russian energy, which will be forthcoming.
Excellent. Well, I think there's a couple issues here that I want to draw on in the discussion. Before we do that, though, I'd like to bring Gabi into the conversation because, Greece, the subject of at least part of our conversation today, sits at a critical juncture. That the access to the Med connects much of Eastern Europe to global markets. We've heard that story on LNG already. There is increasingly efforts to connect electricity and other goods via Greece into European markets. And I think we don't really always think about the geopolitics of these questions, right? So much of what I hear from Europeans over the last few years is we need to reduce our dependencies. We saw what insecurity the Russian gas relationship brought. And then the idea that we're going to connect to even wider swaths of the world on electricity through the Great Interconnection Project. I want to examine those questions. And Gabi, I know that's an area that you've studied a lot. So maybe you can share with us a little bit on the Eastern Med issues and how the region is thinking about connectivity amidst two very challenging conflicts.
Sure. Well, first of all, it's a really great pleasure to be here.
It's an honor to have you on the panel.
I'm really, I'm coming from Israel, so I'm not going to offer a European perspective. I'm not going to offer an American perspective. I'm going to try to offer a perspective from the world upside down, because to be fair, right, not only is the Middle East a different vantage point for trying to understand transatlantic relations and transatlantic opportunities, but coming from an active conflict zone perhaps offers a little bit of perspective when people are talking about hypothetical trade wars. When you come from a real war, fact from fiction, right? I think that, and it was mentioned in the previous panel, the opportunities for connectivity and the lack of, let's call it, European-based energy resources. So there's a need for Europe to connect to its outer regions, to the parts outside of Europe, in order to draw more energy and more opportunity, more business to Europe itself. And certainly in the Eastern Mediterranean, over the last, let's say, 10 to 15 years, there's been a lot of positive diplomatic and commercial progress in that direction. Part of that has been piggybacking off of the natural trade, east-west trade, from the Indo-Pacific, from the Gulf to Europe. but also the new discoveries of offshore hydrocarbons, both in Israel and in Egypt and elsewhere, in order to create a new type of perhaps superhighway, the word corridor was used earlier, and to basically combine financial markets, corporate opportunities, energy infrastructure between Europe, the Gulf, and India, right? I think that in many ways it's easy to kind of dismiss those projects or dismiss the idea of IMEC, this India, Middle East, Europe corridor, as something that's really too big to be achieved. At the same time, when we look at some of the other things that are taking place just in the last couple of years and the transitions that have taken place in transatlantic relations over the last couple of months, anything is actually feasibly possible if you have the right marriage of political interest and corporate interest. And from my perspective and from my vantage point, one of the things that Europe needs to do with its energy policy within the context of transatlantic relations is identify initiatives that have bipartisan American support. And IMEC is a project that at the very least had support from the Biden administration. It basically repackaged elements of the Abraham Accords, normalization agreements between various Middle Eastern actors, between Israel and the Gulf states, and existing commercial trade and interests between India and Europe, and refashioned it as a kind of economic corridor. Ironically, perhaps, because we've spoken a lot about differences between Republicans and Democrats or between Trump and Biden, Trump has vocally expressed support for that project. So if I was to give Europe advice, I would say, at the very least, explore those low-hanging fruits that you're going to get bipartisan support from a very fractured and polarized America.
My friend, this is a think tank panel. You are absolutely allowed, in fact, expected to give Europe advice on how to carry forward. Okay, so let's think about that for just a minute. Like, dial out to the largest scale. Large interdependencies. In a time where it feels like the geopolitical order might be fracturing a little bit, introduce real security challenges, risks to manage. Nikos, from your seat now serving in the Greek government, how do you think about the sort of opportunities that come with a few gigawatts of, pretty dependable, relatively inexpensive renewable power coming out of the Middle East or North Africa, with the immediate needs of Greece and Greece's connection to the EU?
Yeah, well, I think if you go back to even the energy crisis of 2022, yes, it exposed the vulnerability of sort of, you could say, excess dependence on one supplier. But how did we deal with this? We dealt with it with new linkages, with new partners, right? We, in very large part, bought a lot more US LNG, right? So I don't think there is necessarily a tension between drawing these links and enhancing energy security, right? So when I think about the Greek position is, in a world that's changing dramatically, I try to go back to the fundamentals and the things that don't change. So I know that Greece today has and will forever have great solar potential, great wind potential, and so it makes absolute sense to exploit that. We're also looking for hydrocarbons to see whether we have that potential too. I also know that we sit in a specific region of the world, right? So we are going to be a gateway for the Balkans. We're going to be a gateway for the Balkans. We are a gateway for the Balkans in oil. We don't talk about that a lot, but we export a lot of oil products to the region. We are an exporter or transit corridor for gas. And so that geography gives us opportunities to play that regional role. Now, when I zoom out and I look at Greece and the East Med, the Mideast or North Africa, what I see is just enormous potential for collaboration. So if you look at a map of solar potential of Europe, Greece looks really good. And then if you zoom out and you add Egypt, and the scale resets to take into account Egypt, we suddenly go from really good to mediocre. Why? Because the solar potential in Egypt is so much greater. And by the way, Egypt also has great wind potential that seems to be possibly complementary to ours. So, when I look at that, I say this is a trade that makes a lot of sense. The trouble for a country like Greece in thinking about the connectivity with especially essentially North Africa, is the scale of North Africa is so much greater than what we can absorb, right? So if you bring electricity from Egypt and you just bring it to Greece, there's just too much, right? So really for us, it's about refashioning sort of the European network, right? And one of the things we've said many times, and we keep advocating for at the EU level, is at the EU level, we keep doing 27 plans stitched together. And we have to move away from 27 plans stitched together, and we have to go towards one plan that looks at resource endowments. What can each country contribute to the whole? And if you do that exercise, and you suddenly ask not what can North Africa do for Greece, but what can North Africa do for Europe, you get very different answers, right? And let me finish on this point. If you look today, we have 4 natural gas pipelines that connect North Africa to Southern Europe. And we have an LNG trade that essentially goes back, if my memory is correct, I think Algeria started exporting LNG in 1964, right? So, and Libya exported LNG in the past, and Egypt exports LNG. So this is a hydrocarbon trade that has been going back decades. Why not have a similar trade in electricity or hydrogen or carbon capture, by the way? We're talking a lot to Egypt about trade in carbon, in CO2, right? So for us, it makes a lot of sense. It's just that at the scale of what North Africa can offer, and then of course, if you add the Middle East, that just adds a whole other level of volume. It needs to be a solution for Europe, not just for Greece, because we just can't absorb all that volume.
Thomas, maybe you can interject here. There is incredible resource potential. From an EU perspective, how do you look at that? How do you kind of see the Mediterranean countries playing the role of connector, and what role would that play in the affordability and security tensions that you're trying to manage?
It's the best connected energy market in the world, but we're still far from having gotten it right. And Nikos is absolutely correct in saying that we still have 27 different markets, different planning units, and I think because actually the work that you've also pushed for from the Greek side on strengthening the energy union, setting up task force of leaders to look at this, it will also help us in bridging those differences and in a way mitigating these 27 different plans. And in a way, we have to do 2 things at the same time, right? We have to get 27 right, and then we have to bring in our neighbors so that the energy union of the 27 becomes an energy union of the whole wider region, whether it's in the south or in the east or even in the north. And we think that the well-functioning of the European market in a way will be even improved by having these neighborhoods as part of the wider union, both to give more flexibility, a better integrated grid, lower costs, lower prices, etc. But will take some years of work and huge investment opportunity as well. We're talking hundreds of billions of dollars annually that we needed to build this, but actually thereby improving both security and energy supply.
Thank you. Gabby, one last bit on this before I want to touch on a couple more. I mean, I have so many questions about how government works now, but one last bit on this. We often think about, I mentioned earlier, the sort of the security assumptions that underlie the kind of development of these new infrastructures, the expansion of these markets. So too can new infrastructure and the expansion of markets generate opportunities for peace. How should an American think about these large infrastructure projects, the establishment of these new corridors, in managing regional dynamics and providing opportunities for lasting peace and economic development?
Well, this is an opportunity to mention the Global South, which I think hasn't been given enough room within the conversation today. Certainly, even within the Middle East and North Africa, there are many developing countries or countries that are need to start from near zero, right? And I'm thinking about not just Gaza, but obviously Syria as well, that are in desperate need of the influx of not just cash, but job opportunities. And I think that, the scale of IMEC is so big that sometimes it's difficult to think about it in kind of like a practical sense. But that's essentially the conversation that corporations need to be having about how to create interconnectivity, whether it be in electricity or just through commercial trade, that's going to create jobs at the local level, that's going to enable the reconstruction process of destroyed societies, right? And I think that there's tremendous potential, both through the existing hydrocarbons that exist, but also future energy forms. In particular, Nikos already mentioned, solar and wind, and there's at the very least a hypothetical conversation about hydrogen as well, and how those industries can be put to use in order to reimagine not just what the Middle East looks like, but how a reimagined Middle East and North Africa supports European security. Because when we talk about the lack of energy security and its implications on migration, that's directly connected to a European sense of security, right? And so I think that whatever plans Europe builds for itself, and I'm definitely in favor and think that there's merit in creating a unified European plan, right? And speaking in one voice, it needs to take into consideration what kind of interconnectivity do we want with the world that offers the world something back, right? That isn't just for the benefit of European security, but it's in the benefit of global security. So Europe turning from payer to player.
Thank you. Colleagues joining here, and we're going to have a moment for questions, so please do think about what you want to ask these esteemed panelists. But I'll take the privilege to kind of offer one more thought, and that is on this question of what do countries want, right? Our panel earlier was really struggling and wrestling with the transatlantic relationship being in upheaval. And I think when we're in a moment of upheaval, we want to be able to clearly articulate what is it that countries want from each other, what do they want for themselves. And so speaking to an American who casually understands Europe but doesn't really pay that much attention, how should we think about national needs at this moment when it comes to energy security, affordability, climate? Where are we naive about what's happening in Europe and where Europe wants to go? Nikos first.
Well, I think there's a couple of things. I wouldn't use the word naive, but I think there's great awareness of the challenges that Europe has faced over the last few years. So I don't think there's much additional to be said there. I think there's a greater awareness, and this is some of the work that you and I did back at CSIS back in the day, right? That sort of climate policy needs to be articulated in a broader geopolitical context, right? That you can't do climate policy without also thinking about trade policy and economic policy and security policy. And I would say that Europe was maybe a little bit slower in trying to articulate its climate policy in that broader context and thinking through the trade-offs between climate policy and other things. But I do feel that that's sort of changing a little bit over the last several months. So that's sort of one thing I would say that is significant. The second thing is, if you look back and you say there's a certain sort of, the word is not 100% correct, but I would call it malaise, sort of a pessimism. And I think some of it is about what has happened, but I think there's also some of that is about what's coming, right? I think there's a huge amount of anxiety about the cost of the transition, right? So there are a lot of companies I talk to that are not thinking about, what has happened and the cost of energy in the last 2-3 years, but they're looking about the cost of decarbonization, carbon prices going up, the type of technologies that they're being called to deploy. That is producing a great amount of anxiety in Europe that we have to find a way to sort of lessen that anxiety. And I think the other part that is quite insignificant to understand at the European level is that there's also a very robust industrial base. I mean, if you look at the share of manufacturing in GDP in Europe versus the US, it's much higher in Europe on average, right? So there's a strong industrial base that still exists in Europe that is very anxious about what happens to it. Some of it is related to autos and the future of the auto industry and competition with China. Some of it is steel and over capacity. Some of it is established sectors. I mean, here in Greece we have companies that operate in electric cables that are very concerned about competition from China. We're seeing that in the wind industry. So I think the question of how you protect your industrial base, not just purely from the cost of energy, but how do you protect your industrial base from competition while preserving sort of the equilibrium of the internal European market and not leading to huge distortions. So that, I think, those are the equations that, having moved back to Europe, I appreciate a lot more are part of the calculus that when you sit in Washington, you may not fully appreciate the type of things that go into the equation.
As I said, I was in Brussels a couple weeks ago. I was speaking to an official, and we were talking about the transition to electric vehicles, right, and the battery manufacturing. And a lot of European officials were really upset when the United States passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which had domestic content requirements on the full value of the subsidy, right? That was counter decades of trade policy. And then he said, but then we looked around the world, and China has them, countries in the global south, and suddenly the Europeans were the only ones not doing this. And as he's communicated to me, what 6 months ago might have been impossible in this new era of geoeconomics now seems possible, even though it creates tension with the underlying narrative of the European Union. Thomas, maybe you can comment a little bit on that, on this question of industrial competitiveness and cost at the same time that Europe's looking at dramatically increasing spending in the defense industry. And how do you make sure the planning you're doing on the energy side enables a broader and stronger geoeconomic position?
There's sort of a saying in Brussels that we have had free or very cheap defense from the US, free or very cheap energy from the Russians, and very cheap production from the Chinese.
It's all gone away.
Europe's growth over the last decade, and we're in a new world now, where defense comes at a cost, energy comes at a cost, and productivity and competitiveness comes at a cost. So that triple readjustment that we're in the middle of, very much acknowledging that we need to spend more on defense, on energy, and also competitive. And in a way, that's where the energy transition we're talking about here plays a crucial role in bringing down prices, costs, and increasing security. There is, of course, an internal debate on whether you increase your security by then becoming dependent on North Africa or the Gulf or wherever through electric cables. There are some arguing very strongly for it, as Abby just did, and others who are more skeptical and say, well, we have that experience with Russians, so we need to sort of launch ourselves into a new dependency. But there are also those who are arguing, and we talked about migration and pressure on Europe's borders, that by investing in energy capacity in North Africa, we're also investing into actually production capacity there, enabling Egypt or Algeria or Morocco to get access to abundance of cheap energy and hence being able to awake people in production there instead of people wanting to migrate to Europe. So it's a quite complex picture we're looking at. I think we're slowly working our way to a new equilibrium on these things where energy prices will come down, security will go up, and we will integrate our neighbors in the process. And notice the European community was born in the 1950s as a coal and steel union, where coal was really the energy source of the day. And in a way, heard Saudis talking about themselves as the southern neighborhood of Europe, which I think is a new sort of frame of mind for folks to look at the world in that way.
Right. Or a very, very, very old one. Let me turn to the audience for a couple questions. A key reminder that you should introduce yourself and any affiliation you want to claim. And then questions are a brief propositional statement followed by a second sentence, which goes up at the end.
Yeah, thanks very much. My name is Plamen Tonche from the Institute of International Economic Relations. A brief question to Deputy Minister Tsafos. You already hinted at the possible difficulties that Greece may encounter in storing all these volumes of green energy imported from Egypt and Israel through the GREGI and the GSI cables. I wonder, what are the government plans to increase Greece's storage capacity for these volumes? And secondly, just as importantly, what about the high voltage transmission grids that need to be constructed further north in order to transfer all this energy towards the rest of Europe? And a brief question to Mr. Mitchell, if I may, about IMEC. In your view, what would the time frame for the construction of IMEC look like? 5 years, 10 years, 15 years? Can we fantasize a bit about this? Thank you.
If I may amend briefly, I mean, we talk casually now about gigawatt scale data centers, 4 or 5 gigawatt interconnections. You know, Greece has a power system that peaks at 7.5, 9 gigawatts, something like that. How do you think about it? You're a quantitative guy. How do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, look, the Greek system is not massive. I mean, our average load is about 5.5 gigawatts. We go up to 8 or 9 in the summer, really peak around 10, 11. And so when you're talking about, you know, one of the cables from Egypt is a 3 gigawatt cable, right? So that gives you a sense of the scale. When I think about our storage needs, I think about them in the context of balancing our system. I don't think of them in the context of storing energy that we import, right? I think we need storage because we have high levels of renewables penetration, and we need to make sure that we can essentially transfer surplus electricity from the middle of the day to the evening is the main sort of problem that we're trying to solve now with storage. And so we have a number of auctions that we've run with public money to support battery storage. We're building a large pumped hydro facility. One interesting thing about, you talk about storage, but I flipped the question a little bit. One of the main ways in which we in Greece balance renewables is actually through international trade. We export electricity when we have too much solar and wind, primarily wind, and we import electricity when we don't have a lot of wind. So that also shows you the benefit of a continental market in terms of managing intermittency. Now, the way I see Greece for our own needs and also for the electricity that might come to Greece from elsewhere is we need as many corridors as we can to get to channel that electricity north. So we have a cable with Italy existing. We're trying to triple that capacity. We have cables with Albania, North Macedonia, and Bulgaria, and Turkey. You know, we're trying to find ways to expand that capacity where it makes sense. We've put on the table a cable that essentially crosses through the Balkans on the northern side of the Adriatic. We've also talked about how to upgrade the connectivity of the Western Balkans so that energy can flow through there. And the reason I'm giving you 5 answers is because I know each one of those things is going to take a decade, sometimes less, sometimes more, in order to be completed, right? So as a country, what we're thinking about is we need to keep pushing on all these corridors because they're not going to be developed as quickly as we want them. They're going to take time. And so our main emphasis is keep pushing on all those points, recognizing that sooner or later we're going to need them all. I mean, right now, insufficient connectivity, I would say, is one of the biggest pain points for the Greek electricity system. It's not insufficient connectivity of Greece, but it's insufficient connectivity between Southeast Europe and Central Europe, right? So if the main problem is insufficient connectivity, and you can see this, by the way, I mean, if you look at European prices, I mean, you know, we closed the last month at 106 euros. There were parts of Europe that closed the month at 20 and 15 and 30 and 40.
right? So when you look at that system, you realize the enormous potential for connectivity to equilibrate prices. So that's why for us, it's not just about what we're doing, but also about articulating an EU vision where those things are given priority in how we think about what needs to be done.
On the question of speed, Gabby?
Yeah, it's a really great question to which currently there is no answer. But I can tell you a couple of things about IMEC that I think help inform how we understand this project. First is that it's built off of the foundation existing structures of the past, right? It's built on port systems, which were mentioned earlier today. It's built on existing connectivity through trade, and it's built on projects that have not maybe been completed, but have started to take form over the last 10 to 15 years. I think in some ways, when we think about a project that scale and that size, somebody definitely wants to come along and say, it's going to be done by this year. But the idea behind IMEC is about transforming multiple regions for the coming century, right? And so I don't think that there's going to be a singular geopolitical event. And we may, in fact, only realize that IMEC is materializing because a number of individual separate corporate processes are bringing IMEC into existence, and then the politicians come along and rubber stamp it. I think either way, either one of those processes is good, right? It's not necessarily important how you get there, so long as at some point the political and the corporate are merged into one. And I do think that there are tangible projects. We could talk about railways in Saudi Arabia. We can talk about interconnectivity. The Gulf has an extreme need to enhance and increase its interconnectivity, and of course European interconnectivity into North Africa and the Middle East. All these things may take 10, 15, 20 years, but the end goal is something that is lasting and resilient.
Maybe one more? Yes.
Yes, hello everyone. I'm George Findikakis, covering energy issues at Euro Today. Well, a question for Mr. Christensen, actually. We discussed about connectivity, cables, geopolitics, and I would like your take on a critical issue such as the subsea electricity cable supported by EU funding, the Great Sea Interconnector, the GSI. What is your take as a Commission on a project supported by the EU in which the Turkish stance creates so many issues and complications? I mean, will you take any initiatives to address Turkish acts Turkish acts that are hampering the implementation of the projects as a Commission? Thank you.
Volume up. Yeah. Can we have Thomas's volume up? Yep.
I'm saying that this is an issue where the Commission has a role, but I think the Greek government in its dialogue with Turkey also has a role, I would assume, given the importance of the project. There are many issues related to this project that have to be solved, and clearly dialogue with Turkey is part of it. While I have the floor, I would just say on the last question
I hear that, so I'll press you a little. You know, the impression is that the European institutions, government and private sector, have been slower than the US to adopt a lot of digital tools. The best counterexample is demand response tools in utility management. Is Europe really ready to think about giving over the bureaucratic processes for an artificial intelligence enhanced grid?
Europe is definitely willing to investigate and look at where it makes sense and how it can be sped up. Everything is on the table now.
Right. Excellent. All right. Well, we're coming to the end of our time. So before Ian Lesser comes up and offers some closing comments and a benediction on the day, please, with your warm applause, thank our panelists for contributing today, sharing their wisdom. And Ian, I think you have a few words.
Very, very, very briefly, and first of all, Joseph, thank you very much for this session, and good to see you. Just really a brief benediction, as you say. I mean, just to thank a number of people. First of all, to thank our speakers and our moderators, to thank all of you for joining us. Allow me to thank our friends at CSIS for this collaboration, which has now moved from one city to another in a very, very nice fashion. I hope you'll agree that this has really been an extraordinary conversation, a very open one, a very lively one, a really very informative one. So we really thank you for that. A huge thanks to PPC. And George, thank you so much to you, to your colleagues, Alex, Elena, your whole team, actually, for your support, for your partnership in this. Most grateful for that. Allow me some thanks to my colleagues as well at GMF, to Romana, who moderated a session earlier, but above all to Alberto and Hermine, who are here somewhere. Thank you very, very, very much indeed. We look forward to seeing you all again in one of these cities, or perhaps even another one, on either side of the Atlantic. So thank you again, and enjoy your evening. And we have a reception for you. Thank you.
Good job.